Kia ora, good morning, welcome to Connecting the Dots podcast. So I know I've been AWOL, but I've been resting, I've been on a sabbatical. I had promised my boys a couple of weeks ago that I would take a break because doing these podcasts, doing the investigations, doing the work that I do, it's very time consuming and exhausting. And I had promised them I would take a break, but because I'm an intuitive podcaster, I make my podcasts when I'm told to, when I'm intuitively told to. So I've also been getting ready to, I've been gathering up things that I'm going to be leaving behind when my boys and I get ready, when we leave Yorkshire to start a new life once justice comes rolling in, which it is starting to. And I've been, having to go through what I'm taking, what I'm leaving behind, and when I have the money, I'm going to get some boxes and start packing up and just put everything in my living room because I don't use my living room. I don't have a TV or anything, so I'll just put everything in there and then we can just, roll out when it's time to go. So I've been going through all of that, and I've also just, been chilling and absorbing Greek and Roman and Norse mythology, which has been wonderful. And if you see in my community section, I've been putting stuff up there to show you future plans for, when we have our website connected to the radio station and our show investigations, when we're out on the road and stuff like that. So I've been doing all of that and catching up on rest, but I've also been doing research into this case. Now, after I did the Cleveland torso murders, it got me thinking about this case because I think that even though I put a video up a couple of years ago, which I've now taken down, I think I got it completely wrong. So I've been doing some research based on hunches, following the rabbit down the hole, and I have mentioned before that this was a case that my father worked on. He was obsessed with it. It was the one case that he couldn't stop trying to investigate. And I think if he was alive today, I would be ringing him up on the phone and saying to him, "This is what I've been doing. This is the research I've discovered. What do you think?" Now, what I'm about to talk about might not necessarily be naming who Jack the Ripper was. But I think it's going to give you an idea of who he was based on my discovery, if it hasn't already named who he is. If he is on the suspect list, then my research would solidify the fact that it was more than likely one of the suspects, because obviously, we're going to be talking about Jack the Ripper, the most famous unsolved, murder case in the world, the most famous serial killer in the world. There's not a corner of the globe that doesn't know who Jack the Ripper is. So this, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, this was a case that my father worked on most of his life, but he died before the internet became a thing. And so I would love to see his opinion on whether who he thought it was would change based on what I found, or whether, it's confirmed who he thought Jack the Ripper was. Although he never told me who he thought Jack the Ripper was, he always said he felt he knew who did it. So basically, one of the reasons why this case always stuck with me is because his last victim, Mary Kelly, died on the 9th of November 1888, and my birthday's the 9th of November, or she was found on the 9th of November, and it always kind of haunted me a little. She was found and or died on my birthday, which was kind of freaky to me. But after doing the investigation for the Cleveland torso murders, it got me thinking. If you know this case, which most people do, maybe not necessarily in detail, it was highly suspected that he had some kind of medical knowledge, although he had some knowledge of anatomy. They said that he either had to be, like in the medical field or in butchery, knowing how to kill animals. And they said that his attempts to cut into them was crude, like he clearly wasn't an expert, but he knew what he was doing. And after the Cleveland Torso murder podcast I did, research I did, it got me thinking, was he a medical student? And this is where it gets interesting, as I keep saying. So what I discovered was 33 minutes from Whitechapel was a hospital called St. Thomas's. St. Thomas's was known for buying dead bodies. Body snatchers would take bodies to St. Thomas's because it was a teaching hospital, and they would do, medical, like autopsies and that for the students there. And St. Thomas's was, I'll put links in the description box below, did used to pay the Burkers, the London Burkers. They were called London Burkers, named after Burke and Hare, because that's what Burke and Hare did in Edinburgh. And I've seen where they hung out. I've been to the Burke and Hare Tavern in Edinburgh and that. And, when my boys and I get out of here, it's one of the shows that I would like to do. I would like to investigate the Burke and Hare murders and, see what I can pick up and, bring that to life for you so that you can walk the steps of, the most famous body snatchers in the world. So St. Thomas's definitely was a hospital where they took in bodies from the London Burkers. And they were a teaching hospital, and interestingly, they were a teaching hospital for gynecology and obstetrics. And because if you know the way that these women were killed, it's clearly obvious to me now that whoever Jack the Ripper was either training to be a gynecologist or an obstetrician. It has long been suspected that some of these women, because of their chosen profession, would have had terminations and would have had contact with these doctors in training, whether they were doing backstreet terminations or, it was done through these hospitals, I don't know. But I think it's obvious to me that these women were chosen either because of their profession and relying on the backstreet side of terminations from a lot of doctors and training medical doctors who would offer their services in exchange for training on the job, so to speak. Which brings me to one of the suspects, Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. Now, even though he was serving time in Illinois at the time for strychnine poisoning of a lover's husband, there has been speculation that maybe he paid, because he'd inherited a lot of money. He was a very dapper man. He fits the description of Jack the Ripper to a T. Even the way he dressed, driving around in the horse-drawn carriages. He was a very ostentatious, egoic man who liked to flaunt his wealth and his prominence. Now, back in the Victorian era, you were either a physician, a surgeon, or an apothecary. There was like a food chain, and the apothecary was the lowest in the food chain, with the surgeon being the highest in the food chain. Dr. Thomas Neil Cream was a doctor. He was a physician, and in those days, physicians basically just prescribed medication. They would check you out. They wouldn't do anything that involved internal examinations or surgery. They were like topical doctors. They would look at things on the outside and then recommend a treatment for it, where then the apothecary, what we would call a pharmacist, would then prescribe, like write out the prescription so that the patient could then be treated based on what the doctor had recommended the treatment be. Whereas the surgeon if you were a physician, you were called doctor. If you were a surgeon, you were called mister. And the surgeon would then obviously be the one to perform, the operations. And the surgeons were the ones who gave the training in the medical schools for the medical students. Now, interestingly, St. Thomas's Hospital is, in today's standards, 33 minutes away from Whitechapel. And in 1878, Dr. Thomas Neil Cream actually trained at St. Thomas's in London. So there is a connection there. Now, even though it is said that he was serving time in an Illinois prison, someone has come out and said that they believe that he either, because in those days you could pay someone to serve your time for you, or that he paid the guards to let him out early. So he's speculating that he was let out early, or that he paid someone to do his time for him, and then he, came back to the United Kingdom, because he was born in Glasgow, in Mwah, Glasgow. I'm for Glasgow. My boys were born in Dundee, but I say I'm for Glasgow. I'm an East Kilbride girl, because East Kilbride is where we lived before we moved here to Yorkshire. So yeah, I say I'm a Glasgow girl, Glaswegian. I loved Glasgow so much. I can't wait to go there and make shows. There's like a billion places in Scotland I need to go to make shows that I just can't wait. Anyway, so yeah, so Dr. Thomas Neil Cream does have a connection to St. Thomas's Hospital, and he was training to be an obstetrician, and he did perform backstreet terminations to women of the night, so to speak. Now, if the hypothesis of him paying someone to serve his time in the prison in Illinois is correct, or he paid the guards to let him go, if that's correct, then it seems to fit that Jack the Ripper would be Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. But if he did, if he was in prison at the time, because he trained at St. Thomas's Hospital 10 years before the Jack the Ripper murders began. And interestingly as well, the Obstetrics School of London, which was around at the time, it started in like the 1870s, that was 11 minutes away from Whitechapel in today's standards. So, you wouldn't have had the traffic that you do now. So, between St. Thomas's Hospital and the Obstetrics School of London, it wouldn't have taken as long to get to Whitechapel to perform your deeds, because you wouldn't have had the traffic in that, although, you wouldn't have had your fast cars in that. With the congestion in London and that today, I imagine it wouldn't take very long for you to get from your horse-drawn carriage from either the Obstetrics School of London, or, St. Thomas's Hospital, where you were training as a student, to, do your medical training. Like cadavers were expensive, and you could get into a lot of trouble, obviously, if you were caught. And so I think a lot of these medical students took it upon themselves to do behind-the-scenes training, using those that wouldn't be missed as their test dummies, so to speak. So I have either definitively named who Jack the Ripper is, if it can be verified that he did pay to be released early, or paid someone to finish his time, or it at least points the finger in the right direction. Now, this brings me to my another point, is that it would explain the leather apron, because if he was used to doing autopsies and trying to perform surgeries, because St. Thomas's, was gynecological and obstetrics, and obviously the Obstetrics School of London was the same thing. And whoever Jack the Ripper was clearly had an interest in, the female side of anatomy and the reproductive system and, human anatomy and that. So I think, you know, he was targeting them because they wouldn't sort of be missed, because they were considered, you know, like low-life undesirables, blah, blah, blah. But it would explain the apron, because the surgeons would wear leather aprons because obviously they could just wipe the blood off. It would be easier to wipe off. And they were long and, you know, protected their clothes. But there's been this conception that Jack the Ripper was Jewish. And written on the wall, they found that saying, the Jews are men who will not be blamed for nothing, I believe. And I think that this might be a bit of a red herring, to be honest. I think possibly it had absolutely nothing to do with the Jack the Ripper murders, and everything to do with the fact that someone was stating a fact. Because at the time, the newspapers were rife with speculation as to who Jack the Ripper could be. There was a spate of murders. There were more women that went missing before Jack the Ripper, and, you know, more women that were murdered in that before Jack the Ripper, and, you know, more women that died almost in identical circumstances after Jack the Ripper. But the general consensus at the time seemed to be that it could possibly have been a Jewish person because of the writing on the wall. The writing was on the wall. And that's where I fell into that trap in my original investigation. And I think that it was basically a statement of saying the Jews are men who won't be blamed for nothing. Like, you're not going to blame Jewish people for this. You're not going to blame Jewish men for this. And if it's not connected to Jack the Ripper saying, don't you pin this on us, then it's a political statement. Because in my research, what I found is that at the time, there was a bit of anti-Semitism that was going on in London at the time. A lot of people resented the fact when the Jews first came, and they've been there for, you know, I think they started arriving like in the Roman era, like in the 11th century or something, is when Jews started, you know, immigrating to England, and, you know, so anti-Semitism has been rife for quite a long time. But in the Victorian era, a lot of Jews were escaping Eastern Europe, and that after the assassination of what's his name, Tsar Nicholas and his family. And before and after that, like I know there was a massive influx of Jewish immigrants when they were escaping what was going on in Eastern Europe at the time. And prior to that, you know, and like, you know, at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders and that, they were blamed for, I'm trying to be as polite as possible, they were blamed for downgrading parts of London with their presence, you know, because they relied on, you know, like not food banks, what do you call them? Food halls, where they, you know, food stations where they would go and get free food. And for the ones that were lucky enough to be able to have businesses in that, they were seen as like charging exorbitant prices for their products, and, you know, not doing anything to help the struggling Londoner, you know, with the financial issues and that, because poverty was rife, as we know. They were blamed for a lot of things. And I think either that writing on the wall was either them making a statement and saying, don't you dare blame us for this, or it was to do with, you know, don't you blame us for the socio-economic situation that's going on in London. It's got nothing to do with us. You know, it's most of them were just as poor as every other Londoner, but, you know, Londoners were blaming the influx of immigrants on the fact that they were getting poorer and poorer and poorer, because, you know, like, housing was stretched, resources were stretched, you know, like the where they were going to get their meals, you know, their free meals, and stuff, like, they had to stretch everything as far as they could to make sure that everybody ate. But a lot of Londoners at the time were saying, but if they weren't here, there'd be more for us, sort of thing. And so, with the whole Jack the Ripper fear going on, I think a lot of newspapers and even some of the police at the time felt it was easier to pin the blame on the less desirables of society, when in actual fact, if it was Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, he was a very, very wealthy man. He was, a man not afraid to flash his cash, or in the very least, he was a medical student who was training, who was about to become a very wealthy man, because doctors and surgeons made a lot of money. They were given a lot of prestige. They were, regarded in high honour, especially if you were a surgeon. And Dr. Thomas Neil Cream was a physician who was training to be a surgeon, or fancied himself as a surgeon, especially in the areas of gynecology and obstetrics. And if it wasn't him, then that is the field of medical expertise this Jack the Ripper was going into, and seized the opportunity to take it upon himself to train himself in human anatomy and women's anatomy in order to get behind the scenes free training, without having to wait for the hospital to buy more bodies, and at the risk of getting caught and getting into trouble for it. So that's my findings. I have completely changed my point of view. When you see things from a higher perspective, when you change your perspective, you change your mind. And same with the torso murders. It's a little bit embarrassing, the route I thought I was going down, but now I understand the whole Illuminati hierarchy. Sort of, now I understand how all of that works. Now I've been able to solidify my knowledge and understanding of the occult world and the occult sciences, and that it's completely changed my perspective on a lot of things, especially in regards to unsolved murders like Jack the Ripper's. So, you don't have to believe anything I have said. I'll leave links in the description box below. Have a gander at the sites and have a look for yourself. I've put all the research evidence in there to back my claims as per usual. So, you don't have to believe anything I've said. I'm just putting it out there for you to, maybe look at things from a different angle. And I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I am now back on my break. And I will speak to you later. Enjoy. Ka kite anō. Mwah.